There I was, 71 years old, on my hands and knees in my own kitchen, picking up crumbs of the dinner roll I'd dropped while my daughter-in-law Amanda stood over me with that sickeningly sweet smile saying, "Well, Amber, if you're going to be clumsy like a child, you can eat like one too, off the floor." My son Victor just sat there, fork halfway to his mouth, and said absolutely nothing. That was the moment I knew my 43 years of sacrifice, of putting family first, of being the perfect mother and mother-in-law, had earned me nothing but contempt disguised as concern. But what Amanda didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the frail old woman they saw shuffling around their house wasn't the whole story. While they'd been busy treating me like an inconvenience, I'd been quietly managing a portfolio worth $3.7 million, accumulated through decades of careful investments my late husband Thomas had taught me to make. The modest pension they assumed was my only income? That was pocket change compared to what I'd built in 40 years of strategic financial planning. They saw a helpless widow who needed their charity. I saw an opportunity to teach them exactly what charity actually costs. The evening I found myself eating crumbs off my own kitchen floor started like any other Sunday dinner at what used to be my house. I say used to be because even though the deed still bore my name, nothing about this place felt like home anymore. 6 months earlier, when Victor suggested that Amanda and their 2 children move in to help take care of me after Thomas passed, I thought it was a blessing. My son, worried about his widowed mother, wanting to make sure I wasn't lonely in this big empty house where Thomas and I had raised our family and built our dreams. What I got instead was Amanda rearranging my furniture without asking, throwing away my belongings because they were outdated, and gradually pushing me into the smallest bedroom upstairs, while she and Victor took over the master suite where Thomas and I had slept for 37 years. "It's just more practical, Amber," she'd said with that syrupy tone she used whenever she was about to do something that hurt me. "You don't need all that space anymore, and we have the kids to think about." The kids, my grandchildren Betty and Jacob, who barely looked up from their phones when I entered a room, who treated me like furniture that occasionally got in their way. But the real transformation happened so gradually I almost didn't notice it at first. Amanda started making comments about my cooking, how it was too heavy and not nutritious enough for growing children. She took over meal planning and grocery shopping, explaining that she had more energy for these tasks and knew what modern families needed. Slowly, my presence in my own kitchen became an intrusion. My attempts to contribute became criticism of how things were supposed to be done now. Found myself asking permission to use my own stove, apologizing for getting in the way when I tried to make myself a cup of tea. The financial pressure started subtly too. Victor would mention how expensive it was to feed a family of 5, how the property taxes were getting out of hand, how they were struggling to save for the kids' college funds while maintaining the house. Never a direct request for money, just heavy sighs and meaningful looks when bills arrived, just enough guilt to make me offer to help out with utilities and groceries. When I suggested maybe they could contribute to the household expenses since they were living rent-free in a 4-bedroom house, Amanda's face crumpled into wounded innocence. "Amber, we're not freeloaders," she said, tears actually welling in her eyes. "We're here because Victor was worried about you living alone. If you'd rather hire strangers to check on you and pay them thousands of dollars a month, we can certainly make other arrangements." The manipulation was masterful, I'll give her that. Every conversation became about their sacrifice, their generosity in caring for me, their concern for my well-being. When I complained about feeling like a guest in my own home, Victor would remind me how lucky I was to have family who cared enough to uproot their lives for me. When I mentioned missing my privacy, Amanda would suggest that maybe I was getting depressed and should talk to someone about adjusting to this new phase of life. They had an answer for everything, a way to make every grievance sound like evidence of my mental decline, rather than reasonable objections to being systematically displaced from my own existence. But it was the Sunday dinner ritual that really crystallized how completely they'd rewritten the hierarchy in my house. Every week, Amanda would prepare what she called family dinner, which meant I sat at my own dining room table as a guest while she played hostess. The children would chatter about school and friends, Victor would praise Amanda's cooking, and I would smile and nod and try to contribute to conversations that seemed to flow around me rather than include me. When I offered to help with preparation or cleanup, Amanda would wave me away with that practiced martyrdom of hers. "Oh no, Amber, you just relax. You've done enough cooking in your lifetime. It's time for the younger generation to take over." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being treated like a burden for existing in the house I'd spent 3 decades keeping immaculate, cooking thousands of meals in the kitchen I'd designed, hosting countless family gatherings in the dining room where I'd celebrated every birthday and holiday with the people who now saw my presence as an inconvenience to be managed with forced politeness and thinly veiled impatience. That particular Sunday, I'd made the mistake of trying to contribute something to the meal. I'd spent the morning baking my famous apple cinnamon rolls, the same recipe that Victor had begged me to make every birthday throughout his childhood, the same rolls that Amanda had gushed over when she first joined our family 15 years ago. I'd used ingredients I'd purchased with my own money, baked them in my own oven, and arranged them carefully on the antique serving platter that had belonged to my mother. When I carried them into the dining room, proud to finally have something to offer after months of being treated like a decorative but useless ornament, Amanda's expression shifted from surprise to irritation to that saccharine sweetness that always preceded her most cutting remarks. "Oh, Amber," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We talked about this. I've already planned dessert for tonight. The children don't need all this extra sugar, and Victor has been trying to watch his weight." She turned to my son with an expression of long-suffering patience. "Honey, maybe you could explain to your mother about our family's nutrition goals?" Victor, my son, who I'd raised to be considerate and strong, who I'd taught to stand up for what was right, looked at me with the kind of exasperated exhaustion reserved for misbehaving children. "Mom, Amanda's right. We've been trying to eat healthier around here. Maybe next time you could check before making extra food." The dismissal in his voice hit me like a physical blow. These weren't just dinner rolls he was rejecting. This was my attempt to reclaim some small piece of relevance in the home where I'd spent my entire adult life. I stood there holding the platter, feeling foolish and hurt and angry in ways I couldn't even articulate. The rolls were beautiful, golden brown and fragrant, made with love and decades of practice. In any rational universe, a grandmother bringing homemade treats to family dinner would be welcomed, appreciated, celebrated. Instead, I was being lectured about overstepping boundaries I hadn't known existed until I'd crossed them. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I just thought the children might enjoy them. They used to love my baking." The past tense hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose it was. Betty and Jacob hadn't asked for my cookies or asked me to help with homework or sought my company for anything in months. They'd been trained gradually and thoroughly to see me as irrelevant to their daily lives. "Oh, they absolutely love your baking, Amber," Amanda said, reaching for the platter with that practiced smile. "It's just about timing and balance. Tell you what, why don't I put these away for later? The children can have them as a special treat sometime this week when they've finished their vegetables and kept up with their exercise routine." She was already moving toward the kitchen, making the decision for everyone, as she always did, wrapping my offering in conditions and future maybes that transformed a gift into a negotiation. I followed her into the kitchen, feeling compelled to salvage something from this humiliation. "Amanda, I spent all morning making those. Could we at least let the children try one? It's Sunday dinner, after all." My voice carried just enough firmness to suggest I wasn't completely resigned to her authority, which was apparently enough to trigger the response I should have expected. She set the platter down on the counter with just enough force to make the rolls bounce slightly, then turned to face me with an expression of wounded incredulity. "Amber, I really don't understand why you're pushing this. Are you saying that I don't know what's best for my own children? Because if you think I'm being unreasonable about their nutrition and health, maybe we need to have a bigger conversation about boundaries and respect." The word respect, coming from Amanda's mouth while she stood in my kitchen, making decisions about food I'd prepared in my own home, using my own money, for my own grandchildren, struck me as so fundamentally absurd that I actually laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a sarcastic laugh, just genuine amazement at the audacity of the moment. "Respect," I repeated, shaking my head. "That's interesting." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "Is something funny, Amber? Because I'm trying to have a serious conversation with you about family dynamics and appropriate behavior, and you're laughing at me." Her voice had lost its syrupy coating, revealing the sharp edge that I'd been catching glimpses of for months, but had always dismissed as stress or misunderstanding. "I'm laughing," I said, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't quite identify yet. "Because you're talking about respect while standing in my kitchen, making decisions about food I baked in my own oven, for my own grandchildren, in my own house." Each repetition of "my own" felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen so gradually I hadn't noticed it disappearing. Amanda's face flushed, but before she could respond, one of the rolls slipped from the platter and tumbled to the floor, breaking apart on the tile that Thomas and I had chosen together 20 years ago. For a moment, we both stared at it. this small, sweet thing that had taken me hours to make, now scattered in crumbs across the kitchen floor. "Well," Amanda said, her voice returning to that awful artificial sweetness, "look what happens when we get upset and start making demands. Now there's a mess to clean up." She looked at me expectantly, as if the accident had proven some point about my incompetence and unreasonableness. I knelt down to clean up the crumbs, my 71-year-old knees protesting against the hard tile. As I gathered the pieces of my broken roll, Amanda stood over me and said the words that would change everything between us. "Well, Amber, if you're going to be clumsy like a child, you can eat like one too, off the floor." The casual cruelty of it stunned me into stillness. I remained on my knees holding crumbs in my palm, while her words settled into my consciousness like poison seeping into soil. This wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment or a stressed reaction. This was Amanda revealing exactly how she saw me. Not as Victor's mother, not as her children's grandmother, not as the woman whose home she lived in and whose generosity she depended on. I was something less than human to her, something that could be humiliated for her entertainment, something whose dignity was so worthless it could be sacrificed for the sake of making a point about who held power in this house. I looked up at her from my position on the floor, meeting her eyes while I was literally beneath her, and I saw satisfaction there. She was enjoying this moment, enjoying the visual confirmation of my subordination, enjoying the proof that she could treat me however she wanted, without consequences. This wasn't about dinner rolls or nutrition or family dynamics. This was about power, and she was demonstrating that she held all of it. "Eat it," she said again, more softly this time, almost intimately, as if we were sharing a secret. "Go ahead, Amber. Show us how sorry you are for making trouble." From the dining room, I could hear the normal sounds of my family continuing their meal. Silverware against plates, conversation about school projects and weekend plans, the domestic symphony of people who belonged to each other and felt comfortable in their belonging. None of them had followed us into the kitchen. None of them had witnessed Amanda's command or my humiliation. As far as they knew, we were just two women handling a minor kitchen accident with the kind of cooperation and understanding that families are supposed to demonstrate. I stayed on my knees for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, holding those crumbs and staring up at Amanda's face, recognizing with perfect clarity that this was a defining moment. I could eat the crumbs off my own floor and cement my position as someone who could be treated with contempt without consequence. I could stand up and confront her and trigger the kind of family drama that would somehow become my fault because I was the one who couldn't let things go and made everything difficult. Or I could do something else entirely, something that none of them would expect because they'd all convinced themselves that I was exactly as powerless as I appeared. I put the crumbs in my mouth and swallowed them while maintaining eye contact with Amanda, watching her face transform from satisfied smugness to uncomfortable surprise. She'd expected me to refuse, to create the conflict that would prove I was the unreasonable one. Instead, I'd given her exactly what she asked for, and something about my compliance disturbed her in ways that resistance wouldn't have. "There," I said, getting slowly to my feet and brushing my hands clean. "Happy?" My voice was calm, almost pleasant, giving no indication that anything significant had just occurred. But something had occurred, something that Amanda couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt. The power dynamic she thought she'd been establishing had shifted in some subtle way, and she couldn't figure out how or why. I returned to the dining room and finished dinner with my family, making appropriate conversation and laughing at appropriate moments, giving no sign that anything had changed. But everything had changed. In the moment when Amanda had looked down at me, kneeling on my own kitchen floor, and told me to eat crumbs like a dog, she'd revealed not just her contempt for me, but her fundamental misunderstanding of who she was dealing with. They saw an elderly widow dependent on their charity. I saw people who had no idea they were completely dependent on mine. They thought they held all the power because they were younger, stronger, more numerous. I held the deed to the house they lived in, the financial resources they depended on, and 43 years of legal and business experience they'd never bothered to ask about. Most importantly, I held something they couldn't touch or take or manipulate, the absolute clarity that comes from finally seeing a situation exactly as it is. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the small bedroom they'd relegated me to and made a list. Not a revenge list, not an emotional purge, but a practical inventory of assets and options and strategic considerations. The house was worth approximately $850,000, free and clear. My investment portfolio, managed through a firm in the city that none of my family knew about, had grown to $3.7 million over the decades since Thomas's death. My monthly pension was $4,200, which I'd been contributing entirely to household expenses, while Amanda and Victor saved their income for the children's future. More importantly, I had a legal document that none of them had ever seen. A complete estate plan drawn up 3 years earlier when Thomas first showed signs of declining health. In it, I'd left everything to Victor, assuming that he would honor our family's values and take care of me with the same love and respect I'd given him throughout his life. But legal documents can be changed, especially when circumstances reveal that original assumptions were fundamentally flawed. The next morning, I called my attorney, Janet Morrison, who'd been handling my affairs since Thomas's death. Janet was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd built a successful practice by understanding exactly how family dynamics could complicate legal and financial planning. When I explained the situation to her, the gradual displacement, the financial exploitation, the psychological manipulation, and finally the kitchen floor incident, she was quiet for a long moment. "Amber, she said finally, are you calling me because you want to update your estate plan, or because you want to explore your options for reclaiming control of your living situation?" The distinction was important. Updating my will would affect what happened after my death. Exploring my options meant taking action while I was very much alive and increasingly disinclined to tolerate disrespect in my own home. "Both," I said. "I want to understand exactly what leverage I have and how to use it most effectively." I could hear Janet smile through the phone. She'd handled enough family conflicts to recognize when someone had moved from being a victim to being a strategic thinker, and she appreciated clients who approached problems with clear-eyed practicality rather than emotional reactivity. We scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday, which gave me time to gather documents and consider exactly what outcome I wanted to achieve. I wasn't interested in destroying my relationship with Victor or preventing my grandchildren from having a stable home. I was interested in reestablishing appropriate boundaries and ensuring that my generosity was met with gratitude rather than contempt. The difference between those goals would determine everything about how I proceeded. On Tuesday, Amanda made a comment about how much I was spending on groceries, suggesting that maybe I should consider contributing more efficiently to household expenses instead of waste money on unnecessary luxuries like the premium coffee I preferred and the organic vegetables I'd been buying for 70 years. The irony of being lectured about financial efficiency by someone who'd never paid rent or utilities in my house wasn't lost on me, but I simply smiled and agreed to be more mindful of my spending habits. On Wednesday, Victor mentioned that he and Amanda had been discussing my adjustment difficulties and wondered if I might benefit from talking to someone about the challenges of aging in place with family support. The suggestion that I needed therapy to cope with being mistreated in my own home was so perfectly backwards that I almost admired its audacity. Instead of addressing their behavior, they were pathologizing my response to it, turning my reasonable objections into evidence of mental decline that required professional intervention. Thursday morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Janet. Navy blue suit, pearl earrings, the gold watch Thomas had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a competent, financially secure woman making deliberate decisions about her life and resources. When I told Amanda I'd be out for the afternoon, she offered to drive me, explaining that she was concerned about me navigating traffic at your age. I thanked her for her consideration and assured her that my driving skills remained adequate for a short trip to town. Janet's office was everything I'd hoped for, professional, elegant, and completely removed from the domestic chaos that had been consuming my daily life for months. When she reviewed my financial documents, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Amber, you're describing yourself as if you're financially dependent on your son's family, but these numbers tell a very different story. You could live independently in luxury for the rest of your life without touching the principal on these investments." "I know," I said, "but they don't know. They've made assumptions based on what they see. An elderly widow with a modest pension living in a house that's probably worth more than they realize. They've never asked about my other resources, and I've never volunteered the information." I explained how Thomas and I had always been private about money, how we'd taught Victor the value of work and saving without flaunting our financial success, how they'd apparently interpreted our discretion as evidence of limitation rather than wisdom. Janet spread out a legal pad and began outlining options. First option, you could simply establish firmer boundaries while maintaining the current living arrangement. Make it clear that it's your house and your rules, and if they want to continue benefiting from rent-free living, they need to treat you with appropriate respect. She paused, pen hovering over the paper. Second option, you could give them notice to find their own place and reclaim your home entirely. Legally, you'd need to give them adequate time to relocate, but ultimately, you have the right to determine who lives in your house. Third option? I asked, sensing there was more. Janet smiled. Third option is more creative. You could demonstrate the actual value of what you've been providing, not just housing, but financial support, household management, and family stability. Sometimes people don't appreciate what they have until they're forced to replace it themselves. She explained how this could work. I could temporarily withdraw my financial contributions, establish clear expectations for household expenses and responsibilities, and let them experience the real cost of maintaining their current lifestyle without my subsidies. The goal, she continued, would be to create a situation where they understand that living with you is a privilege that comes with obligations, not a favor they're doing for a helpless old woman who should be grateful for their attention. The distinction was crucial. Instead of positioning myself as someone who needed to earn their tolerance, I'd be establishing myself as someone whose generosity deserved their respect. As we discussed specific strategies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. Not malicious anticipation of revenge, but genuine enthusiasm for the possibility of creating a living situation based on mutual respect rather than assumed hierarchy. I wasn't trying to punish them for past behavior. I was trying to establish conditions that would prevent future mistreatment. Janet helped me draft a formal letter outlining new household expectations and financial arrangements. If Victor and Amanda wanted to continue living in my house, they would contribute $1,500 monthly for utilities and property taxes, maintain their own food budget rather than expecting me to subsidize groceries for 5 people, and participate in household maintenance and cleaning rather than assuming I would handle domestic labor as payment for being allowed to exist in my own space. More importantly, we established consequences for disrespectful behavior. The letter made it clear that living in my home was contingent on treating me with the same courtesy and consideration they would show any homeowner who was providing them with below-market housing. If they found these expectations unreasonable, I was prepared to help them find alternative living arrangements that better suited their preferences and budget. The key, Janet explained, is to remain calm and matter-of-fact throughout this process. You're not punishing them or creating drama. You're simply clarifying the terms of a living arrangement that has become unbalanced and unsustainable. She recommended that I present the letter during a family meeting, allowing them to ask questions and discuss concerns, but making it clear that the basic framework was non-negotiable. I drove home that afternoon feeling more centered and purposeful than I had since Thomas's death. For months, I'd been reacting to their treatment of me, accommodating their demands and absorbing their disrespect because I didn't want to create conflict or burden anyone with my needs. Now I understood that my attempts to be accommodating had actually enabled their poor behavior by removing any consequences for treating me badly. The family meeting took place on Saturday evening, after dinner and homework were finished and everyone was relaxed and available for serious conversation. I prepared carefully, rehearsing key points and anticipating their likely responses. When I announced that I needed to discuss some changes in our living arrangements, both Victor and Amanda immediately assumed I was going to apologize for my recent difficult behavior and promised to be more cooperative about household decisions. Instead, I placed Janet's letter on the dining room table and explained that I'd been reviewing our current situation with my attorney and had concluded that some adjustments were necessary to ensure that our arrangement remained fair and sustainable for everyone involved. The word attorney got their immediate attention in ways that phrases like "I think" or "I feel" never could have. Victor read the letter aloud, his voice growing increasingly strained as he worked through Janet's precisely worded requirements. When he finished, the silence stretched long enough for me to study their faces and watch their assumptions crumble in real time. Amanda's expression cycled through confusion, indignation, and something that might have been respect, while Victor looked like a child who'd just realized that his understanding of a situation had been completely wrong. "Mom," Victor said finally, "are you saying that you want us to pay rent? Because we're here to take care of you, not to be your tenants." The genuine bewilderment in his voice told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly they'd convinced themselves that their presence in my house was a favor rather than a benefit. "I'm saying," I replied, keeping my voice steady and warm, "that I want our living arrangement to be based on mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than assumptions about who owes what to whom." I explained that paying utilities and property taxes wasn't rent. It was a contribution to the actual costs of maintaining the home they lived in. Buying their own groceries wasn't punishment. It was normal adult responsibility that most families managed without difficulty. Amanda's response was predictable but still illuminating. Amber, I really think you're misunderstanding the situation here. We moved in because Victor was worried about you living alone after Thomas died. We've been sacrificing our own independence to make sure you're safe and cared for. Her voice carried that familiar note of martyred patience, but it sounded different now that I recognized it as a manipulation tactic rather than genuine concern. Amanda, I said, still maintaining my calm tone, I appreciate your perspective, but I think we've developed some confusion about who's helping whom in this arrangement. I pulled out a folder containing utility bills, property tax statements, and grocery receipts from the past 6 months. I've been covering these expenses entirely while you and Victor save your income for your own priorities. I've been doing most of the household cleaning and maintenance while working around your family's schedule and preferences. I've been accommodating changes to my living space and daily routines to make things more convenient for your family. I spread the documents across the table like evidence in a case, which I suppose they were. These aren't complaints, Fikita, I continued. I chose to handle these responsibilities because I wanted to contribute to our family's well-being. But I also chose to have my contributions acknowledged and respected rather than taken for granted as obligations I owe you for being allowed to exist in my own home. Victor's face had gone through several color changes during this explanation, and I could see him trying to reconcile his assumption that they were doing me a favor with the mathematical reality of what my help had actually been costing me. Mom, we never asked you to pay for everything. If you wanted us to contribute more, you should have said something. I shouldn't have needed to say something, Victor. Adults living in someone's home typically offer to contribute to expenses without being asked. Adults sharing living space typically participate in maintenance and cleaning without being reminded. Adults who care about someone's feelings typically don't stand by silently while that person is humiliated in their own kitchen. The last sentence came out sharper than I'd intended, but I didn't regret it. The kitchen floor incident was the moment when passive accommodation had become active betrayal. Amanda's face flushed. That was a misunderstanding, Amber. I was stressed about the mess, and I spoke without thinking. I never meant to hurt your feelings. The apology was technically appropriate, but it carried an undertone of annoyance that suggested she resented having to make it. Amanda, I said, meeting her eyes directly, you told me to eat food off the floor like a dog. That wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse. That was a deliberate choice to humiliate me in my own home. Whether you meant to hurt my feelings is irrelevant. You chose to treat me with contempt, and my son chose to say nothing about it. I turned to Victor. That's when I realized that our current arrangement isn't working for any of us. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more thoughtful. I could see both of them processing the idea that their actions had consequences, that their assumptions about my dependence and gratitude had been fundamentally wrong, that the comfortable dynamic they'd established was built on foundations that could shift without warning. So what happens if we don't agree to these new terms? Amanda asked, her voice carefully neutral. Then you find alternative living arrangements that better suit your preferences and budget, I said simply. I'm not forcing you to stay here, and I'm not making unreasonable demands on people who choose to stay. I'm clarifying what kind of living situation I'm willing to maintain in my own home. Victor looked stunned. Mom, are you threatening to kick us out if we don't pay you rent? Victor, I'm explaining that living here is a choice that comes with responsibilities. If you find those responsibilities burdensome or unreasonable, you're free to make different choices. But I'm no longer willing to subsidize a living arrangement where I'm treated as a burden rather than a benefactor. The words felt clean and clear as I spoke them, free of the guilt and uncertainty that had been clouding my thinking for months. Amanda asked about the timeline, about what would happen with the children's schools, about how they were supposed to find a place and save for deposits while paying household expenses. All practical questions that demonstrated she was taking the situation seriously, calculating costs and considering options rather than simply dismissing my requirements as unreasonable demands from a confused old woman. You have 60 days to decide whether you want to accept these terms or make other arrangements, I said. That's enough time to explore your options and make informed decisions about what works best for your family. I discussed this timeline with Janet, who had assured me it was legally adequate and practically reasonable. And if we agree to stay and follow these rules? Victor asked. Then we work together to create a living situation based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. You get below-market housing in a good neighborhood with built-in childcare support when needed. I get to live in my own home with people who treat me like family rather than like an inconvenience they're managing out of obligation. The meeting ended without resolution, which was exactly what I'd expected. Major changes require time for processing and discussion, especially when they challenge fundamental assumptions about power and responsibility. I went to bed that night feeling calm and purposeful for the first time in months, knowing that I'd finally taken control of a situation that had been controlling me. Over the following week, I watched them adapt to the idea that their housing situation might not be as permanent and unconditional as they'd assumed. Amanda made several phone calls to rental agencies, researching what it would cost to house a family of 4 in our area. Victor started paying closer attention to utility bills and grocery expenses, apparently calculating how much of their current lifestyle depended on my subsidies. More importantly, their treatment of me changed immediately and dramatically. Amanda stopped making unilateral decisions about household management and started asking for my input on meal planning and cleaning schedules. Victor began including me in conversations about family activities and asking my opinion on decisions that affected the household. Both of them became noticeably more polite and considerate, saying please and thank you for things that they'd been taking for granted for months. The change wasn't entirely comfortable for any of us. Decades of family dynamics don't shift overnight, and we were all learning to navigate relationships that had been redefined by explicit boundaries rather than unstated assumptions. But it was better. Even when conversations felt awkward or forced, they felt honest in ways that our previous interactions hadn't. 2 weeks after our family meeting, Amanda approached me in the kitchen while I was making coffee, in my own kitchen using my own coffee maker, without asking permission or apologizing for taking up space. "Amber," she said, "I owe you an apology that's bigger than what I said before. I've been thinking about how we've been treating you, and I realize that I've been unfair. I got so focused on managing the household and taking care of the children that I forgot this is your home and your life we've been reorganizing." The apology felt genuine in ways that her previous attempt hadn't, probably because it came after she'd spent 2 weeks calculating the financial value of what I'd been providing and comparing it to what they could afford on their own. Nothing creates appreciation for generosity quite like facing the cost of replacing it yourself. "I appreciate that. Amanda," I said, "I think we all got into patterns that weren't working for anyone. The important thing is that we figure out how to move forward in ways that feel good for everyone." "We want to stay," she said. "Victor and I talked about it, and we want to try to make this work according to your terms. But I have a question about the household management part. You mentioned wanting to be included in decisions about meals and cleaning and things like that. I'm worried about stepping on your toes or making you feel like you have to take care of everything again." It was a thoughtful question that showed she'd been listening carefully to what I'd said, rather than just reacting to the threat of having to find new housing. "Amanda, I don't want to take over household management again. I want to participate in decisions about my own home. There's a difference between being in charge of everything and being consulted about things that affect my daily life." We spent the next hour working out practical details about how to share domestic responsibilities in ways that felt equitable rather than hierarchical. Amanda would continue coordinating meals and shopping for her family, but she'd check with me before making changes to kitchen organization or discarding items that belonged to me. I would maintain my own bedroom and bathroom areas, but I'd help with common spaces according to a schedule we'd all agree on. We'd plan family activities together rather than having her make decisions and inform me afterward. Most importantly, we established protocols for handling disagreements and misunderstandings before they escalated into the kind of resentment and contempt that had poisoned our relationship over the past several months. If someone felt disrespected or unheard, they would address it directly rather than letting it fester. If we couldn't resolve conflicts ourselves, we'd seek mediation rather than assuming that someone had to win and someone had to lose. The financial arrangement worked exactly as Janet had predicted. Once Victor and Amanda started contributing to household expenses, they became much more conscious of consumption and waste. Amanda stopped buying expensive convenience foods that I would never eat and started planning meals around ingredients that could serve multiple purposes. Victor started turning off lights and adjusting thermostats with the attention of someone who understood that utility bills had to be paid with actual money rather than simply absorbed by the household budget fairy. More importantly, contributing to expenses made them stakeholders in the household rather than dependents. They started caring about property maintenance and improvement projects because they had a financial investment in the outcome. They became more thoughtful about wear and tear on appliances and furniture because they understood the cost of replacement. The house started feeling like a shared responsibility rather than a resource that existed for their convenience. 6 weeks after our family meeting, Amanda came home from work and found me kneeling in the kitchen, cleaning up crumbs from a sandwich I dropped while making lunch. Instead of making comments about clumsiness or age-related coordination problems, she knelt down beside me and helped pick up the pieces. "Happens to everyone," she said casually. "I dropped a whole plate of spaghetti last week and had sauce on the baseboards for 3 days." The moment was small and ordinary, but it represented everything that had changed between us. 6 months earlier, she would have stood over me making comments about my clumsiness while I cleaned up alone. Now she was beside me, sharing the task and normalizing the accident as something that happened to real people in real kitchens rather than evidence of my declining competence. 3 months into our new arrangement, we developed routines that felt natural rather than negotiated. Amanda still managed most of the cooking, but she asked my opinion about menus and actually used my suggestions. I still contributed more financially than they did, but my contributions were acknowledged and appreciated rather than absorbed as invisible obligations. Victor still made major household decisions, but he consulted me about changes that affected my living space and daily routines. Most importantly, I felt like a person again rather than a problem to be managed. When I spoke, people listened and responded rather than humoring me with distracted attention. When I offered help or suggestions, they were considered on their merits rather than dismissed as interference from someone who didn't understand how things worked anymore. When I needed space or privacy or quiet, my requests were respected rather than treated as unreasonable demands from someone who should be grateful for any accommodation. The financial education aspect of our new arrangement proved particularly enlightening for Victor and Amanda. They'd never really calculated the full cost of maintaining a household for 5 people, assuming that expenses like property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and utilities were relatively minor compared to mortgage payments they weren't making. When they started contributing their share, they discovered that housing costs involved much more than they'd realized. "I had no idea property taxes were so high," Victor admitted one evening as he wrote his monthly contribution check. "And the homeowner's insurance went up again this year." He was looking at the bills with the kind of attention he'd never paid when I was handling everything quietly in the background. "Your father and I were paying these expenses for 37 years, I reminded him. "It adds up to quite a lot over time, especially when you factor in maintenance and improvements and emergency repairs." I pulled out a folder containing receipts for the new roof we'd installed 2 years earlier, the HVAC system we'd replaced the year before, the driveway repairs and exterior painting and appliance replacements that homeownership requires on a regular basis. Amanda studied the numbers with genuine interest rather than the glazed politeness she'd shown for most financial discussions in the past. "Amber, when you add all this up with what you were spending on groceries and utilities, you were basically supporting our entire family. Why didn't you ever say anything about how much this was costing you?" "Because I wanted to help," I said honestly. "I chose to support your family because I love my son and grandchildren, and I wanted you all to be comfortable and secure. But I also expected my generosity to be recognized and appreciated rather than taken for granted as something I owed you for allowing me to exist in my own home." The distinction was crucial, and I could see both of them processing it in real time. Generosity given freely and gratefully received creates bonds of affection and mutual respect. Generosity extracted through manipulation and received as an entitlement creates resentment and exploitation. The same actions can have completely different meanings depending on the context and assumptions surrounding them. "I think we got confused about who was helping whom," Victor said quietly. "We moved in thinking we were doing you a favor, and we never really looked at the actual costs and benefits for everyone involved." He was quiet for a moment, obviously uncomfortable with the implications of what he was acknowledging. "I'm sorry, Mom. We should have been more thoughtful about this from the beginning." The apology meant more coming after 3 months of changed behavior than it would have during the immediate aftermath of our family meeting. It's easy to say sorry when you're trying to avoid consequences. It's much more meaningful to apologize after you've had time to understand what you're actually sorry for and demonstrate your commitment to doing better. Betty and Jacob, my grandchildren, adjusted to the new family dynamics with the flexibility that children often show when adults establish clear expectations and consistent boundaries. They started knocking on my bedroom door instead of walking in without permission. They asked before borrowing my books or using my computer. They included me in conversations about school and friends instead of treating me like background furniture in their daily lives. More importantly, they started seeking me out for the kind of relationship grandchildren and grandparents are supposed to have. Betty asked me to teach her to knit, the way I'd taught her mother 15 years earlier when Amanda was pregnant and nesting with traditional domestic skills. Jacob started asking about family history and wanted to hear stories about his father's childhood that only I could tell. They stopped seeing me as an extension of the household management system and started seeing me as a person with knowledge and experience that might be valuable to them. The changes weren't always smooth or comfortable. Decades of family patterns don't disappear overnight, and we all had moments of falling back into old assumptions and behaviors. The difference was that now we had systems for addressing problems before they became crises, and we all understood that maintaining good relationships required ongoing effort rather than just hoping things would work themselves out through avoidance and accommodation. One evening in late fall, about 4 months after our family meeting, Amanda was preparing dinner when she realized she'd forgotten to buy vegetables for the side dish she'd planned. In the old dynamic, she would have either made do with whatever was available or sent one of the children to the store, never thinking to ask if I might have ingredients she could use. Instead, she knocked on my bedroom door and asked if I had anything in my personal food supplies that might work for her menu. I did have vegetables, premium organic produce that I'd bought for my own meals, and stored in the small refrigerator I'd moved into my bedroom when sharing kitchen space became complicated. In the past, I would have offered my food gladly, but felt resentful that my contributions were expected rather than appreciated. This time I offered the vegetables gladly and felt good about helping solve a problem for someone who asked respectfully and would acknowledge the favor appropriately. "Thank you so much, Amber," Amanda said as she prepared the vegetables I'd provided. "These are beautiful, much nicer than what I would have grabbed at the store. I really appreciate you sharing them." The gratitude was genuine and specific, acknowledging not just that I'd helped, but that I'd provided something of value that improved her meal and saved her time and effort. Small moments like this accumulated over time, rebuilding trust and affection that had been damaged by months of taking each other for granted. We weren't just coexisting in the same space anymore. We were actively contributing to each other's well-being in ways that felt sustainable and mutually beneficial. The most significant change was in my relationship with Victor. For months, I'd watched my son choose loyalty to his wife over fairness to his mother, rationalizing her treatment of me as justified by stress or circumstances, while dismissing my legitimate complaints as evidence of difficult adjustment to aging. Now he was seeing our family dynamics clearly for the first time in years, recognizing patterns of behavior that he'd been ignoring or misinterpreting. "Mom, he said one Saturday morning as we worked together in the garden, "I owe you an apology that goes beyond the financial stuff. I should have stood up for you when Amanda was treating you badly. I should have noticed that you were being pushed out of your own life instead of just accepting her explanations about why changes were necessary." He pulled weeds with more force than necessary, obviously, uncomfortable with what he was acknowledging. "You were in a difficult position," I said, trying to give him some grace while still holding him accountable. "Marriage involves choosing loyalty, and you chose to support your wife even when her behavior was problematic. I understand the impulse, but I also needed my son to protect me from being mistreated in my own home." I told myself that you were just having trouble adjusting, that Amanda was stressed from managing everything, that the problems would resolve themselves if I just stayed out of the middle, Victor continued. But really, I was avoiding conflict because it was easier than addressing behavior I knew was wrong. The conversation was difficult but necessary. Victor needed to understand that his silence during the kitchen floor incident hadn't been neutral. It had been a choice to enable cruelty by refusing to acknowledge it. His failure to defend me hadn't protected family harmony. It had sacrificed my dignity for the sake of avoiding uncomfortable conversations with his wife. "The thing is," I said carefully, "I don't need you to choose between your mother and your wife. I need you to choose between right and wrong, regardless of who's involved. If I were treating Amanda badly, I'd want you to address that too. Family loyalty shouldn't mean protecting people from the consequences of poor behavior." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, both of us thinking about family dynamics and responsibilities and the difference between peacekeeping and justice. When Victor spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "How do I make sure this doesn't happen again? How do I stay aware of patterns instead of just reacting to individual incidents?" It was exactly the right question, showing that he understood the deeper issues rather than just trying to apologize his way back to my good graces. "You pay attention to power dynamics," I said. "You notice when someone is consistently giving and someone else is consistently taking. You speak up when you see disrespectful behavior, even if it's easier to ignore it. You remember that family relationships require active maintenance, not just assumption that love will overcome poor treatment." 6 months after our family meeting, I received a call from Janet Morrison asking how the new living arrangements were working out. Better than I expected, I told her honestly. They're contributing financially, they're treating me with respect, and we're actually functioning like a family again instead of like strangers managing a household crisis. Any regrets about taking such a firm approach? She asked. None, I said immediately. I regret waiting so long to address the problems. I spent months accommodating behavior that was harming all of us because I was afraid of creating conflict or seeming unreasonable. Turns out that clear boundaries and fair expectations create much less conflict than silent resentment and gradual exploitation. Janet laughed. That's been my experience too. Most family conflicts can be resolved through honest communication about needs and expectations. The problems develop when people make assumptions about what others should tolerate or provide without ever discussing whether those assumptions are accurate or sustainable. As we talked, I realized that the changes in my household had affected much more than just daily routines and financial arrangements. I felt more like myself than I had since Thomas died, confident, purposeful, valued for my contributions rather than pitied for my limitations. I was making decisions about my life based on what I wanted and needed rather than what other people thought was appropriate for someone my age and circumstances. Most importantly, I'd learned that respect isn't something that comes automatically with age or family relationships. Respect is something that has to be maintained through consistent boundaries and clear expectations. People treat you the way you teach them to treat you, and I'd been teaching my family that I would accept contempt and exploitation as long as it was packaged with expressions of concern for my well-being. The evening that marked exactly 7 months since the kitchen floor incident, Amanda was preparing one of my favorite meals, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the comfort food I'd been making for my family for decades but hadn't enjoyed in months because I'd been relegated to observer status in my own kitchen. She asked if I wanted to help with the preparation, not because she needed assistance, but because she knew I enjoyed cooking and missed being involved in meal creation. As we worked together, chopping vegetables and seasoning meat, sharing the kitchen space in ways that felt collaborative rather than territorial, Amanda said something that crystallized how much our relationship had evolved. Amber, I want you to know that I understand now why you got so upset about the dinner rolls that night. It wasn't really about the rolls or the nutrition or the timing. It was about feeling dismissed and unimportant in your own home. Yes, I said simply. That's exactly what it was about. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that, she continued. I was so focused on being the perfect mother and wife that I forgot you were a person with feelings and opinions and a right to be heard in your own house. She paused in her chopping, looking directly at me. And I'm sorry about what I said to you on the floor. That was cruel and inexcusable, and I've been ashamed of it every day since. The apology was everything I'd needed to hear, but had never expected to receive. Amanda wasn't just acknowledging that she'd hurt my feelings. She was recognizing that she'd deliberately humiliated me and accepting full responsibility for choosing cruelty when kindness was equally available. The shame she mentioned wasn't self-pity. It was appropriate remorse for behavior that had violated basic human decency. Thank you, I said. That means more to me than you probably realize. I continued seasoning the roast, thinking about forgiveness and family relationships and the difference between accepting apologies and rebuilding trust. The important thing is that we figured out how to treat each other better going forward. That dinner became a celebration of sorts, though we didn't explicitly acknowledge it as such. Betty and Jacob told stories about school and friends, including me in conversations naturally rather than dutifully. Victor talked about work projects and asked my opinion about career decisions, treating me as someone whose decades of life experience might offer valuable perspective. Amanda shared her own work challenges and family concerns, including me in the kind of intimate domestic conversation that I'd been excluded from for months. Most importantly, I felt like a host in my own home rather than a guest being accommodated by more important residents. I offered wine from bottles I'd chosen and purchased, served food on dishes I'd selected and maintained, shared stories and opinions and observations that were heard and valued rather than politely tolerated. It was the kind of family dinner I'd been hoping for since they moved in. Warm, inclusive, genuinely affectionate, based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. After dinner, as we cleaned up together according to the rotation schedule we'd established, Victor pulled me aside for a private conversation. Mom, I've been thinking about your will and estate planning. Amanda and I both realized that we made a lot of assumptions about inheriting this house and your assets, and those assumptions probably influenced how we treated you. He was obviously uncomfortable with the topic, but determined to address it honestly. Yes, I agreed, they probably did. When people assume they're entitled to someone's generosity, they stop appreciating it and start resenting any limitations or conditions placed on it. I want you to know that we don't expect to inherit anything, Mifia, he continued. We're grateful for what you're sharing with us now, and we want to maintain a good relationship with you regardless of what happens to your estate in the future. The statement was clearly rehearsed, but it sounded sincere rather than calculated. Victor, I said gently, I've never wanted to use my will as a weapon or a control mechanism. I've wanted to leave everything to you because I love you and want you to be secure after I'm gone. But I also want to know that my final gift will be received with gratitude rather than entitlement, and that you'll honor the values and relationships that were important to me. We talked about legacy and responsibility and the difference between inheritance as a gift and inheritance as an expectation. Victor assured me that the changes in our relationship over the past several months had taught him to appreciate what he had rather than assuming he deserved more. He promised that future decisions about my estate would be based on current relationships rather than past assumptions or future obligations. As winter settled into spring, our household rhythms became increasingly natural and comfortable. Amanda and I developed genuine friendship based on shared domestic responsibilities and mutual respect for each other's contributions. Victor rebuilt his relationship with me as an adult son who valued his mother's wisdom rather than just managing her limitations. Betty and Jacob grew closer to me as a grandmother who had interesting stories and useful skills rather than just someone who existed in the background of their daily lives. The financial arrangements that had initially felt like negotiations became simply how we managed household expenses, no more complicated or emotionally charged than any other practical aspect of living together. Victor and Amanda contributed their monthly payment without resentment, grateful for below-market housing that allowed them to save for their children's education and their own retirement. I contributed additional funds for improvements and emergencies without feeling exploited, knowing that my generosity was acknowledged and appreciated. Most importantly, I felt like I was living my own life again rather than adapting to someone else's version of what my life should look like. I made decisions about my daily routines based on my preferences and needs. I spent my money on things that brought me joy rather than just covering expenses that other people created. I participated in family activities because I wanted to be included, not because someone was managing my social needs out of obligation. 1 year after the kitchen floor incident, I was preparing breakfast in my own kitchen when I accidentally knocked a bowl of berries off the counter. As I knelt to clean up the scattered fruit, Amanda appeared with a dish towel and knelt beside me without comment or drama, helping gather the berries as if spilled food was a normal part of kitchen life rather than evidence of anyone's incompetence or need for management. "Thank you," I said as we disposed of the damaged berries and wiped juice from the floor. "Of course," she replied casually. "Happens to all of us." The exchange was unremarkable, which made it perfect. A year earlier, the same accident would have triggered comments about my declining coordination and suggestions about safety modifications and discussions about whether I should still be preparing my own meals. Now it was just a minor kitchen mishap that two competent adults handled together without assigning blame or meaning beyond the simple fact that sometimes people drop things. As I finished preparing my breakfast, I reflected on everything that had changed since that Sunday evening when I found myself eating crumbs off my own floor. The humiliation of that moment had been the catalyst for reclaiming my dignity and establishing boundaries that protected my well-being while preserving family relationships that mattered to me. I'd learned that age doesn't automatically entitle you to respect, but it also doesn't disqualify you from demanding it. I discovered that family love doesn't excuse family cruelty, and that protecting someone's feelings often requires confronting their behavior rather than accommodating it. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that it's never too late to change dynamics that aren't working, even when those dynamics have been years in the making. The woman who had knelt on her kitchen floor a year earlier, humiliated and powerless, had been real. But she hadn't been the whole story. She'd been one version of me, created by circumstances that I'd had the power to change once I stopped accepting them as inevitable. The woman making breakfast in her own kitchen, surrounded by family members who treated her with genuine respect and affection, was equally real and much more sustainable. Amanda and Victor had learned lessons too. They'd discovered that generosity has limits and that crossing those limits destroys the very relationships generosity is meant to strengthen. They'd learned to distinguish between helping someone and controlling them, between concern and condescension, between family loyalty and family exploitation. Most importantly, they'd learned that respect isn't something you give to people you pity. It's something you show to people you value. The changes in our household had rippled outward into other relationships as well. I'd reconnected with friends I'd been neglecting during the months when I felt too ashamed and diminished to maintain social connections. I'd resumed activities and interests that I'd abandoned when my daily life became focused entirely on managing other people's needs and expectations. I'd started making plans for travel and projects and experiences that reflected my own priorities rather than just accommodating everyone else's. Most importantly, I'd reclaimed my sense of myself as someone with agency and purpose rather than just someone with problems that needed to be managed by more competent people. Age had changed my physical capabilities and energy levels, but it hadn't changed my fundamental worth as a person or my right to be treated with dignity in my own home and my own life. The kitchen floor incident had been a moment of revelation disguised as humiliation. In the space between Amanda's cruel command and my decision to comply with it, I'd seen our entire relationship clearly for the first time. Her contempt, his silence, my acceptance, all of it had been leading to that moment when the power dynamics in my own home became visible and undeniable. But revelation is only valuable if it leads to action, and action is only sustainable if it's based on genuine power, rather than emotional manipulation. The changes I'd made weren't revenge, they were corrections. I hadn't punished my family for past behavior. I'd established conditions that would prevent future mistreatment while preserving the relationships that mattered to all of us. Now, as I sit in my living room on Sunday evenings, watching my family interact with the kind of natural affection and mutual respect that makes a house feel like a home, I understand that dignity isn't something other people can give you or take away. Dignity is something you maintain through your choices and boundaries and expectations. It's something you protect by refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, even when that treatment comes from people you love. The 71-year-old woman who ate crumbs off her kitchen floor taught me that lesson more clearly than any philosophy book or self-help guide ever could have. She showed me exactly what happens when you prioritize other people's comfort over your own self-respect. But she also gave me the motivation to change everything that needed changing, to reclaim everything that had been lost, and to create the kind of family relationships that honor everyone's dignity rather than sacrificing some people's worth for other people's convenience. That woman is still part of me, a reminder of how quickly respect can erode when it's not actively maintained. But she's no longer the whole story. Now she's just the beginning of a much better story, one about an older woman who refused to accept unacceptable treatment, who had more power than anyone realized, and who used that power not for revenge but for restoration of the dignity and love that families are supposed to provide for all their members.